It's Thursday, January 30th, 2025, and you are listening to Matters of Policy and Politics, a Hoover Institution podcast devoted to governance and balance of power here in America and around the free world. I'm Jonathan Mervide, Senior Product Manager at the Hoover Institution, and I'm sitting in the chair of Bill Whalen, the Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Distinguished Policy Fellow in Journalism, so that he can answer questions and provide commentary about California policy and politics, in which he is well versed. Bill Whalen, in addition to being a Washington Post columnist, writes weekly for Hoover's California On Your Mind web channel. Whalen is joined today by Leo Hanian, Hoover Institution Senior Fellow, Professor of Economics and Director of the Edinger Family Program and Macroeconomic Research at the University of California, Los Angeles. Ohanian also writes weekly about the policy environment of the Golden State for California On Your Mind. Good day, gentlemen. Let's talk about the latest developments in policy and politics in the Golden State. We had a very tragic month in California. Nearly 30 people lost their lives in multiple Southern California wildfires. California, Bill, you argue, has a long legacy of natural disasters. You assert that, sure, Californians chose to live here and many are unprepared for what might happen, a fire, earthquake, what have you, but Los Angeles really missed the mark. Bill, in your view, why was Los Angeles caught flat-footed and the blazes not adequately prepared, for example, with proper water infrastructure and fire mitigation resources? And what will be the political outcome? Will heads roll?
Well, let's see, 30 seconds or less, right? It's, California does not corner the market on tragedy, and we should, stop and, give our condolences, our prayers, our best thoughts to any and all who were affected by that terrible plane crash in Washington, D.C. last night. We were talking about this off the air. I used to live in Washington. I've made that landing, dozens, if not hundreds of times. And it's, your mind goes back to how many times you're going through it when it happens. But you asked about California. It's very funny. A couple months ago, Lee and I were having a conversation about California On Your Mind. And I talked Lee into the concept of us dialing back a little bit in 2025. And my rationale was that, well, it's going to be kind of a slow news year here. It's not an election year. There's only so much that we can write about Donald Trump's weird relationship with the state or Gavin Newsom's presidential prospects or homelessness or, a lot of the things Lee likes to get into. So let's just do a column every week. And I still stand by that. But the fires in Los Angeles are a reminder that stuff happens. And in California, stuff happens unexpectedly. Disaster strikes us in all sorts of ways. It was 31 years ago that I came out to California. I was supposed to come out here at this very time in January, and my trip got delayed because of the Northridge earthquake. A lot of people are drawing parallels between this and Northridge in this regard, in that it does involve Los Angeles, and it comes down to the question of the cleanup afterwards. And I really want to get Lee's thoughts on how this is going to happen in a civil, productive, efficient way. But you're kind of talking apples and oranges when you're talking the fires and the quake in this regard. The big challenge coming out of the Northridge quake was fixing the Santa Monica freeway, which had been flattened. And that was done. That was done in about 74 days, I think, which is about, it was a year and a half estimate for it getting done, but it was done rapidly because basically got state government out of the way and encouraged contractors to work around the clock and work for a profit. And so it got very done. But that is not to diminish that work. That's much less complicated than when it comes to rebuilding a community, which is going to get into all sorts of complicated issues in terms of permitting, in terms of environmental regulations, in terms of what a rebuilt Pacific Palisades and Altadena should look like in terms of housing, things which Lee's written about brilliantly for California On Your Mind, I might add. At the end of the day, I'm focused on one thing, and that is leadership in California. Now, back in the 90s, I worked for Pete Wilson, governor. He really shined in this moment. He was an executive born and bred. Dick Reardon was the mayor of Los Angeles at the time. The story is told that the quake hit at 4:31. At 4:32, Dick Reardon was out of bed and barking orders to people. This is what leaders do. You look at Los Angeles right now, you look at California writ large, and there is just a dearth of leadership out there taking charge. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass is going to be very hard pressed to get reelected next year if she does go through with her reelection plans because she has just been lacking in her response to this. Gavin Newsom's response has been very complicated. On the one hand, he is kind of letting Bass and the city wallow in this. On the other hand, he is interjecting himself into it, kind of a halfway position. Crisis management is not his strong suit. And, I want to get Lee's thoughts on this thing he has now called LA Rises, which is his idea to bring people together to rebuild. You look at our congressional delegation. We have a very bad presence in Washington right now, which I wrote about California On Your Mind this week. And then what really stood out to me, Lee, was that there are a lot of people lined up to run for governor in 2026, including the former Los Angeles mayor, among others. And nobody, Lee, and I mean nobody in the 2026 field has come forward with ideas about what to do for Los Angeles. And so This, Lee, is just very problematic for California's future.
Well, Bill, it is. It's such a tragedy, and I feel very fortunate. I lived at Pacific Palisades for several years, and the home my family and I lived in now is completely destroyed. The entire street is destroyed. So we feel very fortunate that we moved away from that area. Many of our friends lost their homes. One good friend of mine texted me a photo of his home, which is on Sunset Boulevard on the south side of Sunset Boulevard, so on the ocean side and not on the mountain side where the fire started. And obviously the fire jumped across Sunset. And he texted me a photo of this lot. And the caption in the text of the photo read, he's a very funny guy. He somehow preserved his sense of humor in this moment. And the text read, for sale, one chimney, good condition, because in the photo, all you could see amidst the rubble was his chimney and the fireplace. That was all that was left of his home. So it has been indeed devastating, enormous economic losses, including loss of life, loss of property, loss of business income, and productivity and production as businesses were destroyed. And Bill, it brings back interesting comparisons. So before my time, there was a terrible fire in Bel Air, which is another high risk fire area in Los Angeles. It's just north of Sunset Boulevard, right across from UCLA. So in between Brentwood and Beverly Hills along Sunset Boulevard. And there was a terrible fire there in the early 1960s.
Mhm.
And in response to that, and I think was Pat Brown governor at that time?
He might have been. He was governor up until January 67.
Yeah. I think he was governor in 61, 62 when that fire broke
Yes,
out.
he was. Mhm.
But I believe just 2 or 3 years later, the city had invested heavily in fire protection and had built several new fire stations, invested significantly in fire hydrants, invested significantly in helicopters. And remember, this is over 60 years ago. They had just made a massive push because it was obvious what needed to be done. And Bill, I agree with you. The type of leadership that was present at that time, and I can't remember, I don't know who was mayor in LA at that time, maybe Sam Yorty. But the type of leadership present then and the ability of the state and local governments to get things done fast, to have a clear vision of what needs to be done to protect people was just so much different than today. And we often, it's obvious that the number one priority for government should be protecting its citizens.
Right.
And in many ways, that just seems to have been lost today.
So, Lee, I'm going to give you 3 storylines here, and I want you to pick which one of you want to run with. Storyline number 1, a lot of very good reporting done by the Los Angeles Times on how the city was just really woefully unprepared for this moment in terms of the ferocity of the fires, water infrastructure system that seems outdated, can handle maybe 2 fires at best, but can't handle 4 at the same time. The reports we've seen of fire hydrants not working in the Palisades, so forth. So issue number 1, Lee, is one of water in Los Angeles and water preparation for disasters like this. Story number 2, Lee, would be the government's relation with its people. In that, just as we went through COVID and a lot of complications over mask mandates and so forth, right now, somebody who's back in the news is Barbara Ferrer. Our listeners may not know that name. If they go back to our COVID podcast, they'll hear it because Barbara Ferrer is the head of she's the head of public health in Los Angeles County. She is an easy pinata for conservatives because she is a doctor, but she's a doctor, I think, in social welfare. So she's not an MD. So you raise the question, why is she in charge of health policy? Though she does have a graduate degree in health policy, but she's not a doctor. So she's making kind of medical related decisions as such. And I mention her because just as she was at the heart of the mask controversy in Los Angeles during COVID, she's back in the news again because, Lee, you have a lot of angry people in the Palisades, and I have some friends who count among this whose houses were spared, and they just want to get back in their houses and just get some fresh clothes and some possessions and they want to clean up their house and get back to normal, and they won't get in, and they can't get in because she's saying there's too much ash, too much smoke. It's possibly a health hazard. So I mention this, Lee, because this is kind of a freedom issue, if you will, for people in the relationship with the government. So that's story number two. But then the third one, Lee, which is a big economic one, is California in the matter of insurance. I think we're going to be surprised to find out how many people in the Palisades either A, did not have insurance to begin with, or B, have inadequate insurance. Maybe they tapped into the state fair fund, which is out of money, I think, or running out of money. You may know better than me, Lee. But fair, the way it works, is kind of like Obamacare for insurance in California. Fair has a limit on how much you can be covered, though. It's a $3.1 million, I think, Lee. Well, I looked at the median retail price of homes in the Palisades. It's $4.7 million. So a lot of people are going to go, they're not going to get covered or not. And then there's the future about what, what you're going to be paying for insurance in California writ large as well. So three things to look at, Lee: LA water structure, the relationship between government and people, and insurance. So pick one, my friend.
Yeah. Yeah. LA was woefully unprepared. Bill, as you point out, one of your recent columns, Mayor Karen Bass was in Ghana for, I believe, a presidential inauguration there. Despite the fact that there was very reliable forecasts that there was going to be a severe Santa Ana wind condition, which hit California, frequently, typically not in January, but she was warned that fire was very possible.
And adding to that, Lee, when she ran for mayor in 2022, she had said time and again, "I'm not going to travel abroad. I'm not going to junk it as a mayor." Oops.
Yes, yes, I recall that as well.
I'm sorry, but go on.
And then, in terms of water, another issue, kind of going back to that Bel Air fire in 1961, is that the Pacific Palisades was remarkably vulnerable. When you look at a map of fire risk in Los Angeles, Pacific Palisades is right in the middle of severe fire risk. So a reservoir was built in the hills of Pacific Palisades, an area called Palisades Highlands, and a reservoir was built that was called the Santa Ynez Reservoir. My former home had a view of the Santa Ynez Reservoir. It holds approximately, I believe, 117 million gallons. And that reservoir had been drained in early 2024 because a floating cover had a tear on it. And apparently the tear needed to be repaired and the water needed to be drained. I don't know why the water would have to be drained, but in any case, that reservoir had been drained and it had been empty since early 2024.
Right.
So so when you look at this, there's just a lot of what if questions. What if the cover had been fixed and the reservoir had not been empty for month after month after month, and helicopters could have gone in and picked up water and dropped water on the flames when the fire potentially could have been contained. I remember reading an LA Times story that I believe reported the first aerial water was not dropped on the wildfire until 53 minutes after it had been reported. So when you think about response time like that, you wonder again, why did that take so long? Why weren't more fire crews and more firefighting capital, such as fire engines, such as helicopters, why weren't those positioned for high-risk areas such as Pacific Palisades? So there's just a lot of what if questions that people should be very, very substantially thinking about and questioning. And you mentioned Bass and Newsom. When Newsom first came to Los Angeles, and it was reported that the fire hydrants had run dry, and the governor was asked, why that was the case, and his first response, I believe, was something along the lines of, "Well, the local folks will figure that out." And then later on, it was, that's a very inadequate response. So then he ordered an investigation into why they ran dry. And Bill, you talked about insurance. There's been a property insurance crisis in California long before the wildfires. Chubb, I believe, announced it will report, I believe, over $1 billion of claims in the first quarter. Reflecting LA wildfires. So we already have a crisis, insurance crisis in California, and now we have this. So this is, I mean, this could be a disaster in terms of insurance. And Bill, you mentioned the FAIR plan, which is kind of the insurer of last resort for people who simply can't get traditional homeowners insurance. They go to the FAIR plan. It's very expensive. It has limited coverage, as you noted, and it is subsidized by insurance companies within the state offering traditional insurance. My understanding is that if you want to do insurance business in California, you have to participate in the FAIR plan, and your participation is proportional to your presence in the traditional insurance market. And moreover, if you want to increase property insurance rates, you have to file that through California's insurance department, and that tends to be a very costly and long process. So you've had many insurance companies pulling back their presence in the state or leaving the state. Either November, December, the insurance commissioner, Ricardo Lara, announced some reforms. I personally don't think they're going to be enough because it requires insurers who are writing traditional insurance to write 85% of 85% of high risk coverage relative to coverage in non high risk areas. And in return for that, they get to price their risks a little bit more aggressively, which will mean higher premiums. And the approval process for rate increases, apparently it's been streamlined. But since that was announced, a subsidiary of Liberty Mutual, I believe, is reducing their presence. On the other hand, farmers have said they will increase their presence in California, but I don't see the reforms as going to really move the needle. So this could be just a substantial challenge within California, certainly in terms of rates, because you're not, like any business, you're not going to stay in unless you earn a competitive return on your investment. And California is a high risk place. And one reason being that we simply don't do enough to protect people.
So we can't count on Jake from State Farm, and it sounds like we can't count on Limu the emus. We're in trouble here. But Lee, there is somebody actually to blame for all of this. And if you're a fan of the legislature right now, our friend Scott Wiener, if you want to count it a bad idea coming out of the legislature, look for Scott Wiener's name on it. But he's at it again, Lee, and he's come up with a bill. You know what the bill does, Lee? It says that if you lost a home in the fire, you can sue Big Oil. Why can you sue Big Oil? Because Big Oil is what causes climate change. And climate change is what's to blame here. So go sue the oil company.
Yeah, I just, when I see this type of stuff, I just shake my head because California has experienced Santa Ana winds. As long back as we've recorded weather, using modern equipment. These are winds that are powerful that come from the deserts. Humidity levels drop. This was a very powerful Santa Ana wind, but I don't know if these were the strongest Santa Anas we've ever had or not. But what really puzzles me about responses like this is that when the Santa Ana winds come, this is the equivalent of the barbarians are at the gate. So you're either ready for the barbarians or not. And if you're not ready for the barbarians, they storm the gate and they come in and you lose your village. So for those who think that climate change is about what happened, I will say to them, then you demand from your state and local government, they invest heavily in protection. That's the only sensible choice that we have here. And in my opinion, we simply haven't done that.
Okay, Dr. O'Hady, if you let Big Oil off the hook, what about the Delta smelt? And here, I think maybe you need to talk about your California on Your Mind column, where you talk about California water policy, because speaking of winds, the President of the United States came to California late last week, and he seems to be of the mind that one of the problems here is that there's not enough water flowing north to south to put out the fires.
Yeah. Back in the day, again, when I say back in the day, 1960s, 1970s, up to the early 1980s, California was, Bill, as you know, it was the go-go state, enormous population growth. We invested heavily in water infrastructure because, Cal Surprise, that's what people need in an arid climate. So in the 50s, 60s, 70s, we built the Central Valley Water Project. We built the California Water Project, enormous, hugely successful investments. with very high implicit rates of return to taxpayers. And California at that time was all about, if we're going to tax you, we promise you, you will receive a very attractive rate of return on your investment from public goods and services. And I think that was absolutely the case back in the day. Um, the heavy investment in water, you know, really stopped in the 1980s. And this just is, in my opinion, this is, former Senator Dianne Feinstein in around 2016 mentioned, what we have roughly the same water infrastructure today. Now that was in 2016. California was probably at a population close to what it is today, somewhere around 39 million. She said, we have the same water infrastructure today as we had, decades ago when the population was, half of what it is today.
Right.
And yes, she was absolutely right. We simply hadn't invested in that. And it's become very expensive. One reason is substantial environmental regulations and environmental lawsuits that prevent us from building new water infrastructure. And until we solve that, we're not going to be able to deliver the type of water protection that Californians need. It is a shame, and the governor of the state legislature can do a lot on this. They have a supermajority. They can change the California Environmental Quality Act. Interestingly, Bill, Newsom, I believe, has streamlined his. He has this vision of rebuilding LA. And to streamline rebuilding, I believe he's going to do an executive order that will exempt the review process from CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act. I believe also the Coastal Commission. Is that right?
Yeah, he's already acted on a coastal commission. He's already told them to butt out, which is a good sign, because if you talk to builders, they'll tell you if you're building in the area under the coastal commission's domain, they'll add a good 2 years to the rebuilding process just by dragging their feet. So good for the
Yeah. Yeah. So I agree. I agree with the governor. That's an excellent choice. On the other hand, it's unfortunate that it took Armageddon to get that done.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, on the topic of streamlining, last week, President Trump held a roundtable with Los Angeles leaders, including Mayor Bass. Trump and Bass jostled over the pace of recovery and rebuild efforts for homeowners. President Trump thought the process wasn't happening fast enough. From Newsweek, the briefing got tense after Bass brought up allowing residents to quickly rebuild from the damage after clearing hazardous waste from properties, prompting Trump to insist that residents were facing a delay of 18 months to rebuild. On Friday, Trump threatened to link disaster relief to California with a voter ID requirement in that state.
Yeah.
Bill, will he make good on his threats and possibly disrupt California's relief efforts, especially possibly its water flow?
I think he, at the end of the day, will probably back off this in this regard. There's a lot of pressure from within the California delegation, the Republican side of it, actually, specifically a few members from down in Southern California who barely survived the last round. They don't want this to become a football. So they want the aid to come flowing in. Otherwise, they will take a hit next year for it. So I think he's going to back off of that. But I do think there is going to be a larger conversation to be had about California, what Lee alluded to earlier about forest management. It's interesting. I spent part of yesterday going through the new House power lineup, if you will, just to see who's in charge of what. I wanted to see what California's position was. And there's not a single Californian chairing a prominent committee, but if you dig a little deeper, you'll find, for example, that Doug LaMalfa, who's a congressman from up North California, he chairs the agriculture subcommittee on forestry. There's nothing stopping Congressman LaMalfa from holding a hearing, and I'd recommend he do so. And bring in Governor Newsom and bring in California officials and discuss why you do or do not clean your forest and get a picture on that. And they could do the same on water policy that Lee mentioned as well. So I think the smarter play politically for Trump will be to give the aid. Don't tie it into state voter ID. It's just not germane to this conversation. But then let the Republican Congress kind of turn loose on California and put Newsom and others a spotlight that way. I don't know. What do you think, Lee? Does that make sense, or am I misreading Trump here?
Though it's interesting. It's hard to predict, at least for me. It's hard to predict what he will do.
Yes.
He's certainly very good at gamesmanship. He's used the threat of tariffs very effectively against countries, most recently Colombia. So he seems to have a pretty good sense of when to make threats, and perhaps when not to make threats. I agree with you. I don't think this will ultimately be tied up into issues such as voter registration. Yes, I think it would damage the state's Republican Party. It's interesting. The cleanup is going to be, no pun intended, just a complete mess. One important aspect of that cleanup is that California is the leading consumer of electric vehicles. I believe by far. I don't have the numbers, but I believe California has, as a share of registrations, California is either the highest in the United States or certainly among the highest. And Pacific Palisades is a wealthy neighborhood. Wealthy households own more electric vehicles than poor households because they are expensive. And those batteries exploded. There's a lot of toxic materials in those batteries. So when it comes to cleanup, my understanding is that the EPA will be doing the first phase of that cleanup, which will be the full hazmat, removing toxic waste. And there's thousands of acres of toxic waste. And the LA Times reported that process could take over a year. So once the toxic stuff is removed, then my understanding, and this from the same LA Times article, is that the Army Corps of Engineers will come in and try to prepare the area for rebuilding, and that would be called phase two. I don't believe they've issued a timeline for how long that would take. And then you think about, well, of all the homes that were damaged or destroyed, there's only so many electricians and carpenters and plumbers and roofers, and they are going to be in high demand. And we know how markets work. When demand increases, the price goes up. So rebuilding is going to be very, very expensive, in my opinion. And it's,
But my question, Lee, is what exactly are they going to rebuild? What is it going to look like? Because it's getting back to the 94 situation. Simple challenge. Just, okay, what the freeway looked on January the 16th, 1994, make the freeway look the same when it's open. It's just a road. But here,
yeah,
they're talking about redesigning the Palisades. So the question, Lee, is that could it be as simple as just rebuild the houses as they were, or are we going to get now bogged down in a lot of environmental regulations? Are we going to get into a lot of state mandates over multiple housing and so forth? In other words, this could get very ugly very fast.
Oh, yeah, it certainly could. And when you think about the Palisades, there were businesses there that were built back in probably in the 1950s or 1960s. There was an old school hardware store that had been there forever. Gelson's supermarket had been there. That was a bit more modern. But there was a shopping center where the hardware store was. There were a lot of old buildings there. There were, many old buildings along Sunset Boulevard.
Village.
So I'm sure there'll be some commissions about, quote, reimagining the Palisades, unquote. And yeah, there'll be a lot of competing interests there. Rick Caruso, who, as you know, ran against Bass for mayor, and I believe he spent over $100 million of his own money on the campaign. He's got a major shopping area there, which I believe he protected with private firefighters. Bill, do you remember that?
Yes, he did. He took a little bit of a hit in the press for it, but he saw the fire coming and he managed to get private firefighters in there, and they spared it. So
They were able to save that. So I suspect she'll probably be involved in that process. He's obviously a very successful developer, but I certainly hope it doesn't get bogged down into this issue about, oh, well, we're going to turn the Palisades into half multifamily homes and make sure 30% are for low income, and the types of mandates that have essentially failed.
Well, I had to bring it up, Lee, because you've written about this, about the town of Atherton, for example, next door to Palo Alto here, about how they've been going over this country about housing. And just, this would seem an opportunity for that conversation to be had, because you have an incredibly wealthy community that has been flattened. So now you can start from scratch. So what does the state imagine?
Yep. Yes. And this community with relatively little multifamily housing, mostly single family homes, many of which were built back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. I don't want to make prediction about what that will be, but I could well imagine that could be another mess.
I want to ride the hobby horse on leadership one more time in this regard. This fire comes at a rather crucial time for Los Angeles in this regard. The Summer Games, the Summer Olympics are in 2028. They're not that far away when you think about it. And Mayor and Casey Wasserman, who's on the governor's LA Rise's effort to rebuild Los Angeles, they're doing their level best to put on a good show in Los Angeles. And part of that involves just cleaning up Los Angeles and make Los Angeles look better and run better. So you've had much more animated conversations about the homeless population, Lee, a lot more conversations about moving people around. I'm looking forward to seeing what this does to your beloved UCLA in terms of what's going to happen there in terms of dorms and so forth. But now you not just have to rebuild Los Angeles in orderly fashion, but you have to kind of show the world, which is coming to Los Angeles in 2028, that this city has its act together.
Yeah, yeah, Bill. In the '84 Olympics, I believe Peter Uberoth was the one who was directing that, and
Yes.
he did an amazing job. The city ran remarkably well. But now they've got not just only the additional problem of LA is a more difficult city to manage, but I believe over 40,000 acres have been burned. In terms of the Palisades fire, not I don't, it didn't cross the 405, at least not to my knowledge. And so UCLA was not affected, and I think other venues have not been affected directly. But that cleanup effort, that rebuilding effort, will still be going. So at best, getting a city ready for the Olympics today is a Herculean task, and this makes the challenges that much more difficult.
And there's an economic component here too, that if you're a business thinking about coming to Los Angeles to set up, do I want to be in Los Angeles? Because in addition to the cost of living, finding a place for my business and so forth, now we're getting into the housing issue, the insurance issue, and so forth. So it's complicated. I'm glad you mentioned Rick Caruso, by the way, because he did run for mayor in 2022. He barely lost to the current mayor. And he's been very visible since the fires broke out. Not sure it's because he has a personal stake in it, because assuming he wants to run again in 2026, he is tailor-made for this moment now, because if you are kind of fed up with the political establishment in Los Angeles and California, here's a guy who's not part of it. But I wrote about this earlier for California Mind earlier this month in this regard. Karen Bass has a very long record of public service. I think she was a community organizer at one point. Then she got into the state legislature. She actually was an assembly speaker at one time. She then went to Washington and was a member of Congress. So it was about a 20-year run or so, culminating with her coming back and running for mayor of Los Angeles. People might remember that she was on Al Gore's shortlist for vice presidential pick. So in an alternate universe, she could have been in Kamala Harris's position last November, getting crushed by Donald Trump, I imagine. But the point here is that in a time of crisis, you need somebody who is an executive, who has executive skills. Sometimes that doesn't always translate. Sometimes executives are deers in the headlights. Trump was this way when the pandemic broke out. But with Bess, what you've seen in Los Angeles is she just has not responded well. The trip to Africa, you mentioned Ghana. What a terrible choice, as it not Ghana get reelected. But I looked around the rest of California. It's very interesting. If you look up at Oakland right now, poor beleaguered Oakland, they have a special election. Their mayor got recalled last November, and so they're going to have a vote in April for a new mayor. Hey, you know who's jumped into the race? Barbara Lee. Barbara Lee, who ran for the Senate, finished fourth, I think. A very poor campaign, very poor showing for her. But she's doing now what Bass did in Los Angeles. After 20 years in the legislative process, she wants to come back and run a city. I think it's going to be a mess. Lee and Jonathan, if you look across the bay in San Francisco, while Los Angeles was up in flames, San Francisco is saying hello to a new mayor. It's Daniel Lurie. And Daniel Lurie is not a product of city politics. It's the first time going back to the Truman Eisenhower years that they've gone this way with the mayor. He is a philanthropist. He is a son of wealth and privilege. He comes from Levi Strauss fortune. But he is trying to run San Francisco as something of a common sense outsider. And Lee, I'm very fascinated to see how far he's going to get with this.
Yeah, Bill, he's going to benefit from a board of supervisors, which I think will be much more amenable to his ideas. There are fewer really super hardcore progressive people on the board of supervisors now. So I think he can get some common sense things done within the city. And Bill, when you mentioned political leadership, well, I mean, the one word that comes to my mind when thinking about what's happened within LA and just more broadly in California is it's not really leadership. It's just very reactive. There's not a proactive presence, in my opinion. Within the city or just more broadly, not enough proactive political forces within the state saying, here's what our vision is. Here's what we're going to do today to get there. It's more just very reactive. Oh, we've had this fires and now we've got to rebuild and that's going to cost, tens of billions of dollars rather than saying, just imagine if a small fraction of that had been invested in protection. You think about California being the technology innovation center of the world. In Silicon Valley, and then also with other universities such as Caltech and UCLA. And it's just hard not to imagine what might have happened had more technologically innovative solutions been used to perhaps identify fires before they get to the point where they become impossible to contain. I mean, this fire was reported the way fires were reported, back in the day when someone was standing outside in their deck and they saw flames and they saw smoke. So there's just a lot of what ifs involved with this. And in my mind, a lot of the what ifs come down to what if we had just made more sensible allocation of the enormous budgets within the state and within the city of Los Angeles. This potentially could have been avoided. The fire chief had complained about having her budget cut.
Mhm.
I believe I did the calculation. The fire budget, I believe, is under 7% of the city's total budget. And that budget is one that's now strained by homelessness and a lot of spending on that. So again, it's just like another what if. And you get back to the idea of the number one priority for government is to protect its citizens. You think about fire budgets of under 7% in a place like Los Angeles that has so many high risk areas such as Pacific Palisades and Malibu, the Altadena area, the area around Griffith Park. You just scratch your head and you just ask, what if we had made better decisions?
I think also, Lee and Jonathan, Californians themselves have to kind of come to a reckoning here in terms of their existence in this state in this regard. I've been here to live long enough. I've been here long enough to remember when Tom Selleck was doing PSAs on television about fire prevention, and he'd walk around his house and show how he'd cleaned out shrub, blah blah blah. I'm not sure how effective that is when it's 100-mile-an-hour sand of wind coming at you. I think you're pretty much a goner. But anyway, the point was he's trying to say there are things we can do to mitigate, our exposure to fire. Um, my question to you, Lee, you live down in Santa Barbara. Do you have an earthquake kit in your house right now? I will confess I do not have one in my house, and I thought about putting one in my garage, and I thought, well, wait a second. If I put one on my garage as an electric, it's an electric door, the power's going to go off in an earthquake. I can't get the garage open for it. But you're supposed to have a list of things, some water, some basic food and supplies and stuff like that. But I'd wager good money most Californians are not similarly prepared. And I mention this because part of living in California, as Jonathan mentioned in the beginning of this, is understanding that you are really exposed to disasters, and it's fires and mudslides and earthquakes and infestations, you name it, we get hit by it. But it just seems a lot of Californians, Lee, just kind of obliviously go on with their lives and don't really think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. But, unfortunately, as the months and years go by, this will be forgotten.
Mhm.
Like the Santa Rosa fire, I think has largely been forgotten. Certainly in the, within the state outside of the Santa Rosa area. So earthquake kit, I think my wife has packed a few things for us, but, certainly not, we're certainly not survivalists. And I don't know how many Californians have earthquake insurance. I suspect it's a very small number. Deductibles are very, very high. So people live here, and they take on the risks. And again, when you have 39 million people living in a state where it could be fire, it could be flood, it could be mudslides and debris flows, that's really where your focus has got to be. And investing in infrastructure, And we just simply haven't done that. I mean, living in Santa Barbara a few years ago, we had a terrible fire. Our home was unaffected. We had to evacuate for a while. But then we suffered mudslides and boulders coming down off the mountains because the mountains had been barren from the fire. And I believe 23 or 24 people, my neighbors, lost their lives, and there were catch basins for the boulders to be stopped. And there was an LA Times article about that. It's very, they did a very nice investigative piece, and those debris flow basins had not been cleaned out apparently for years. So again, it just really points the finger at state and local government and saying, this is what you need to do. This is where your focus and your priorities have to be. And we just haven't seen that.
Yeah, but it's just there's something about the psyche of California. It's just living with risk. I live next door to Menlo Park, and I like to go for long walks through Menlo Park through this one old beautiful neighborhood called Allied Arts. And there's one house in particular I adore. It probably was built in the 1930s or 40s. It has this kind of old, kind of Tudor look to it. And it has this ginormous, and I mean, the tree must go up 150 feet in the sky. I think it's a redwood. It's just this monster of a tree. And I walk by and I think, whoever lives in that house must be the most confident, calm person, because if I lived in that house, I'd be looking outside of that tree every night, wondering, when's it coming down on me? But Californians live that way. But I would point out, by the way, our intrepid moderator, Jonathan Modroivus, lives in Arizona, and he just must be laughing at this conversation right now because, Jonathan, you own a home in Arizona. I mean, what kind of insurance preparation do you have? Because we're not talking about earthquakes and fires where you live, I trust.
No, it's just, no, we don't
Heat.
have, yeah, it's just the heat. That's the main thing. It's just preparing for the heat for the summertime. But in terms of disaster, we don't worry about the earthquakes, or the fires as much. Although there are some fires up north and other places like that. We don't really worry about it as much as people do in California,
Mhm.
fortunately for them. I wanted to ask you, Lee, about the water supply issue, getting back to that. In your California on Your Mind column earlier this month, you described the implementation of California's permanent water rationing regulations that took effect on January 1st. The regulations will affect 405 water providers serving 95% of the population. Newsweek reported that under the plan, estimated water delivery will be reduced by as much as 92% in one city. The intent of the rationing is to increase water supply reliability, you write, but why hasn't the state just expanded water storage and conveyance rather than simply make these reductions in usage?
Yeah, Jonathan, it's again, it's just very frustrating. When California is growing so quickly, it didn't think about the idea of, well, we've just got to limit people's water usage. They never even really thought about that. They just thought people need water. We'll build piping, we'll build storage, we'll build transmission lines for water conveyance. And they did that, and they did that very, very quickly. The California Water Project and the San Joaquin, the Central Valley Water Project, were just enormous physical investment undertakings. It's a huge state, and we provided substantial water for most people, and provided adequate water for state agriculture. And now it's just become just so difficult, so costly, so long delayed to build new water conveyance and new water storage projects. So what the state has done instead is to say, well, if it's so expensive and so time consuming and so difficult to expand water supply, I guess we'll just have to stop people's water demands. So we now have effectively permanent water rationing. Now this differs across the state. There is one community that apparently is going to get a very substantial reduction in water usage. In some areas, won't be affected or won't be affected very much, but it just really highlights how the vision of government supporting its constituents has changed from a vision of growth and prosperity and abundance to a vision of, oh, well, you can't use water so much anymore. And, the column goes into some of the environmental lawsuits that have confronted many of these projects, some of which have been, at least in the planning stages for decades and still have not been realized. And this, I think, is what is very, very frustrating for Trump. He sees this and just shakes his head and says, what is the matter with this state? Why can't they get their act together on something as simple as water? And this is why he's making the, telling Newsom, hey, you've got to get your act together on water. And yes, we should get our act together on water. And a simple way to do that would be to amend California Environmental Quality Act and potentially maybe other environmental regulations as well, because it's costing way too much, it's taking way too long. And people, particularly farmers, are suffering an awful lot from this.
So, Lee, I have a solution. It's a silly solution to in what is otherwise a serious conversation, but hear me out on this. So, President Trump got into controversy the other day. He wants to reduce the federal workforce. And so he offered to buy out federal workers, saying basically, I'm going to pay you through September if you leave now. And I think there's going to be litigation now against that, if you will. Can he do this? But here's my thought, Lee. I got thinking about this when you mentioned earlier about, California trying to solve problems of a state with 38 or 39 million people, when back in Pat Brown's heydays, it was more like 15 million people. Why doesn't Donald Trump offer money to about 10 million Californians in Los Angeles and San Francisco to leave California and move to Greenland? And we will make it the 51st state of America in honor of Mar-a-Lago. We'll call it Mara Igloo. But we will just, we'll take Greenland with 10 million Californians and we'll build it from scratch. And depending on who moves this, they could have a referendum. You could have a progressive utopia. You could have a conservative utopia, something in between. But just kind of, along the ideas of deforestation, just kind of clear out about 1/3 of California's population. And maybe that kind of helps with all our challenges with Mother Nature.
Well, Bill, I know you're saying that tongue in cheek, but there is an economic reality
Yes.
in that there are lower income households living in California, realistically cannot live here on their own.
Right.
To live here requires, a lot of public support and public assistance. And there's a difficult conversation at some point the state needs to have about whether it's equipped, it can actually feasibly support so many million people who really can't afford to live here on their own. So that is that. Yeah. So I know you said that tongue in cheek, but there is a very important and difficult economic reality in the issues you bring out.
Yeah, and because when you have these debates in California over, single payer health care, it's the state budget and things like that. It comes down to one thing. We just have too large of a safety net in California. We just have too big of a population. So there has to be a way we can't turn back to the 1960s in terms of pure innocence and space and all that. But again, just tongue in cheek, if California was, 2/3 the size it is right now, I think life would be considerably different here.
Yes, it would be considerably different. Yeah.
Gentlemen, we talked a lot about the what ifs. Now let's talk about the what to dos. Bill, you talked about the 1994 Northridge quake, robust building effort afterward.
Right.
Can Governor Gavin Newsom do what your boss, Pete Wilson, did when he used his emergency powers after Northridge to freeze regulations and incentivize a speedy reconstruction? And what other types of things, Leah, like your input on this, can California do? Is it, incentivizing insurers to come back into the marketplace for help on the rebuild? Is it, new irrigation techniques? Is it finding new water water resources as we talked about? Bill, sir?
I'll let Lee do the economics of it. I'm going to go back to the leadership side of this. Okay, credit to the governor. He is saying the right things. He wants to keep the Coastal Commission's snout out of this. He wants to ease some regulations. It begs the question of why these regulations aren't eased to begin with, why only in emergencies it's done. So he is saying the right things. But with Gavin Newsom, the devil is always in the details, and the devil is always in the process. And this is a governor who likes to create task forces. And, he called for an independent investigation, as Lee mentioned, but I have yet to see really who's going to do the investigation and what direction it's going to go. It's very easy to see this getting off the rails in this regard, and that you create these initiatives to come up with creative ideas, but you don't ultimately come up with a plan. He needs a very good point person in Los Angeles. Maybe it's Dee Dee Myers, who is his point person in Sacramento on all things Hollywood and entertainment. Maybe she takes over, but somebody has to kind of step in and be his Los Angeles, dare I say, czar. I hate that word in government, but somebody has to be the recovery czar and be on the ground and knock heads together, because Newsom's idea is I'm going to bring the city, the county, the state all together. But, that is potentially a governmental Tower of Babel when you get down to it. So the governor Needs somebody who's going to just really kind of put the whip to government and just make stuff happen. Lee, what say you?
Yeah, I very much appreciate that he is suspending Coastal Commission review of rebuilding in these areas, and he said he's going to suspend CEQA related reviews as well. I applaud those efforts. Again, I think it's unfortunate it took Armageddon to get that done. But Jonathan, it's going to take years. Even if we had the vision of saying, let's go back to the California vision of expanding, of using our talent to expand investments in water and transportation, in the kind of capital projects we built back in the day, that would take years to get done. Problem with politicians is that they're always running. And when you look at things like California Environmental Quality Act, which Jerry Brown once called, reforming that is doing the Lord's work.
Right.
I think in Sacramento, they understand they understand it's a law that is doing a lot of damage, is impeding a lot of progress. But they also understand that there are powerful political lobbies in place that they would be pushing away should they vote for such reforms, and they don't want to do that. Now that is interesting because when it comes to Governor Newsom, he's termed out in 26, and perhaps he wants to run for president. There's the publication The Hill had a review of his popularity across 30 polls, and this was national, and I believe his popularity was under 30%.
Yeah.
So if the governor wants to run for national office at the presidential level, what better way to do that than really mobilize and marshal the state's talent and address CEQA, address the various regulatory and political impediments that have done a lot of damage to the state. And what better way for him to establish a more productive national presence than get this done under his watch. So I think there are political opportunities for him to maybe push back against the traditional political impediments to making progress in the state. I don't know if he's going to do that, but certainly suspending CEQA and the Coastal Commission is a great start on that.
But Lee, I can't think of a more California challenge than this. I mentioned the 2028 Summer Games in Los Angeles. 2028 will also be the 20th anniversary of when we first laid down money for high-speed rail in California. This great adventure showing the world that California can build just a kick-fanny high-speed rail. And as I think the three of us would agree, it has been just a hot mess, if not a disaster, since it's begun. California can't build stuff. And if you can't build stuff as a society, what does it say about your innovation, your imagination, your competence? So again, this is the challenge for Los Angeles. It's not just rebuilding the Palisades and Altadena and Malibu and all the afflicted areas. It's showing that California could actually get something done. And so the ball is now in Governor Newsom's court and Mayor Bass's court, and every concerned Angelito in California wants to get this done. Let's see if they can do it.
Let's see if they can do it. I think there's enormous political gains to the governor if he can do that.
Yes,
I agree with you, Bill. I think Bass. I think that ship has sailed. I don't see her having really having much of a political future. But at the national level, I think this is what getting California back on track could really catapult the governor. So yeah, let's see if you can do it.
As always, this has been an hour of insightful and timely analysis. Gentlemen, thank you for your time.
Thank you, guys.
You've been listening to Matters of Policy and Politics, the Hoover Institution podcast devoted to governance and balance of power here in America and around the free world. Please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast wherever you might hear it. If you don't mind, please spread the word, get your friends to have a listen. The Hoover Institution has Facebook, Instagram, and X feeds. Our X handle is @HooverInst, that's @HooverInst. Bill Whalen is on X. His handle is @BillWhalenCA. And Leo Haney is also on X. His handle is @Lee_Haney. Please visit the Hoover website at hoover.org and sign up for the Hoover Daily Report, where you can access the latest scholarship and analysis from our fellows. Also check out California on Your Mind, where Bill Whalen and Leo Haney write every week. Again, this is Jonathan Mavroidis sitting in Bill Whalen's chair this week. He'll be back for another episode of Matters of Policy and Politics. Thank you for listening.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution. where we generate and promote ideas advancing freedom. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.